The night security guard was charged with theft and management replaced him immediately until we found which facilities director had been stealing equipment. Raymond Kutcher was escorted out of Meridian General Hospital by 2 uniformed officers on a Wednesday morning in September while I was clocking in for my shift in the radiology department. I watched through the glass doors as they walked him across the parking lot in handcuffs, while hospital administrator Carol Denning stood near the entrance with her arms crossed. Raymond kept his head down and didn't resist. He'd worked night security at Meridian for 9 years, and everyone knew him as the quiet guy who made rounds with his thermos of coffee and helped nurses carry supplies when he passed their stations. By noon, the entire hospital knew Raymond had been arrested for stealing medical equipment worth over $40,000. The thefts had been discovered during a routine inventory audit that showed missing diagnostic machines, surgical tools, and pharmacy supplies over the past 6 months. Security footage allegedly showed Raymond accessing restricted storage areas during his overnight shifts and loading equipment into his vehicle. Hospital management acted swiftly and decisively. Carol Denning sent a staff-wide email stating that Meridian took theft seriously and had cooperated fully with law enforcement to remove the perpetrator from our facility. Raymond was terminated immediately and banned from hospital property. His replacement started the following night. Nobody questioned it. Nobody defended Raymond. The collective assumption was that night security had the access and opportunity to steal without oversight, and the evidence seemed conclusive. I worked as a radiology technician and had been at Meridian for 4 years. Raymond and I crossed paths occasionally during evening shifts when I stayed late processing imaging requests. He'd always been professional and helpful, once staying an extra hour to help me move a malfunctioning CT scanner when maintenance was unavailable. I'd never seen him act suspiciously or inappropriately around hospital property or equipment. But I also understood that thieves often appeared trustworthy. That was how they operated successfully without detection. My initial reaction was disappointment that someone I'd considered decent had betrayed the hospital's trust. Except something bothered me about the inventory audit timeline. The report claimed equipment had been disappearing steadily over 6 months, with the most recent theft occurring the previous Friday night during Raymond's shift. I'd been working late that Friday processing emergency scans from a multi-vehicle accident. The radiology department was near the main equipment storage area where some of the stolen items had been kept. I'd been in and out of that hallway multiple times between midnight and 4 in the morning. Raymond had passed by twice during his rounds, stopped briefly to ask if I needed anything, then continued his patrol. I never saw him enter the storage area or carry anything unusual. The hallway had security cameras covering every entrance. If Raymond had stolen equipment that night, the footage would show it clearly. I didn't mention my observations immediately because I wasn't certain they mattered. Maybe the theft happened during a window when I'd been focused on patient scans. Maybe Raymond had moved equipment during a different shift. The audit report had identified multiple incidents over months. My single night of observation didn't disprove systematic theft. But the doubt lingered through the following week. I kept thinking about Raymond's expression when the officers had walked him out. He'd looked confused and resigned, not guilty or panicked, just defeated by something he seemed unable to process. On Thursday, I was having lunch in the cafeteria when I overheard 2 supply chain coordinators discussing the inventory audit. One mentioned that the missing equipment list included items from departments across the hospital: radiology, surgery, pharmacy, even maintenance tools from the facilities department. The scope seemed unusually broad for a single thief operating during night shifts. The other coordinator said the audit had been initiated by Dale Priestley, the facilities director, who'd noticed discrepancies in maintenance equipment logs. Dale had flagged the problems to Carol Denning, who'd ordered the comprehensive inventory review that revealed the extent of the losses. Dale had apparently been vigilant about tracking hospital assets and deserved credit for exposing the theft. I knew Dale casually from departmental meetings. He'd been facilities director at Meridian for 3 years and had a reputation for being detail-oriented and cost-conscious. He ran a tight operation and frequently emphasized accountability for hospital resources. Something about Dale discovering the thefts struck me as convenient. Facilities directors had broader access to hospital storage areas than almost anyone else. They controlled keys, access codes, and maintenance schedules. They knew security camera coverage and blind spots. They understood inventory systems and audit procedures. If someone wanted to steal hospital equipment systematically, the facilities director position provided perfect cover and opportunity. The accusation forming in my mind felt dangerous and irresponsible. Dale had exposed the thefts, not committed them. He'd brought the losses to administration's attention and helped build the case against Raymond. Suspecting him of framing an innocent security guard required evidence beyond gut feeling and speculative reasoning. But I couldn't dismiss the inconsistency between what I'd witnessed Friday night and the accusations against Raymond. I decided to review the security footage myself. Meridian's surveillance system was managed through the facilities department, which meant Dale controlled access, but radiology had separate cameras for our equipment areas due to the expensive diagnostic machines we housed. Those cameras fed to a local server I could access with my departmental credentials. I pulled up footage from Friday night and watched the hallway outside equipment storage from 11 p.m. through 6 a.m. Raymond appeared multiple times during his rounds, walking past with his flashlight and clipboard. He never entered the restricted storage area, He never carried anything besides his standard security equipment. The footage proved Raymond hadn't stolen equipment during his shift that night, at least not from that location. But the audit claimed thefts had occurred over 6 months across multiple departments. One night of footage didn't exonerate him from all accusations. I needed to understand the full scope of the alleged thefts and compare them against Raymond's actual access and opportunity. I requested a copy of the inventory audit report through official channels, citing my role in radiology asset management. The request was denied by Carol Denning's office with a terse email stating the audit was part of an ongoing criminal investigation and not available for general staff review. That refusal felt wrong. Department heads and asset managers should have access to audit findings affecting their areas. The secrecy suggested management wanted to control the narrative and limit scrutiny of their evidence against Raymond. I decided to approach this differently. I contacted the police detective handling Raymond's case. His name was Frank Holloway, and he'd been with the department for 20 years. I called his office and explained I was a Meridian employee who'd witnessed events contradicting the theft timeline. Frank agreed to meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop away from the hospital. I brought the radiology security footage on a USB drive and explained what I'd observed Friday night. Frank watched the video carefully before saying it was interesting, but didn't prove Raymond's innocence across all alleged thefts. I asked Frank what specific evidence had led to Raymond's arrest. He said the hospital had provided security footage showing Raymond accessing restricted areas during overnight shifts when thefts occurred. They'd also provided audit documentation showing equipment disappeared on nights Raymond worked. Combined with his access and opportunity, the case seemed solid. I asked to see the hospital's security footage. Frank hesitated before saying that footage was evidence in an active case and not available for public review. I said I wasn't public. I was a hospital employee reporting exculpatory evidence contradicting the accusations. Frank studied me for a long moment before saying he'd been bothered by something in the case himself. The hospital's footage showed Raymond near storage areas during relevant time frames, but never actually showed him taking anything. The video evidence was circumstantial. Raymond's proximity to thefts suggested guilt, but didn't prove it. The arrest had been made primarily on administrative recommendations from Carol Denning and Dale Priestley, who'd assured police the evidence was conclusive. Frank had questioned whether the case would hold up at trial, but his supervisors had pressure from hospital administration to move forward quickly. I asked if Frank would be willing to review additional security footage if I could access it from other departments. He said he couldn't encourage unauthorized investigation, but if evidence emerged through proper channels, he'd evaluate it objectively. I left that meeting knowing I needed to access security footage from multiple areas where thefts had allegedly occurred. The facilities department controlled that system, which meant going through Dale would be impossible. But hospitals had redundant camera systems for liability and safety reasons. Every department maintained some local recording capacity, even if footage also fed to central monitoring. I spent the next week quietly talking to colleagues in different departments about their security systems. Surgery had cameras covering their instrument storage. Pharmacy had cameras monitoring controlled substance areas. Maintenance had cameras in their equipment bays. Each department stored footage locally for at least 30 days before archiving. I explained to each department head that I was concerned about the theft investigation and wanted to verify security procedures were functioning properly. Most were cooperative, believing I was conducting legitimate safety review. I collected footage from the 6-month period covering alleged theft dates from 4 different departments. Then I spent 3 evenings reviewing hundreds of hours of video, cross-referencing timestamps with the inventory audit dates I'd managed to piece together from departmental gossip and email fragments. What I found was damning. Raymond appeared in the footage doing his normal security rounds, but never entered restricted storage areas or carried equipment. However, Dale Priestley appeared frequently in footage from all departments during overnight hours when he shouldn't have been on site. Dale accessed surgery storage at 2 a.m. on a night when surgical instruments went missing. Dale entered the pharmacy storage area at 3 a.m. on a night when medication inventory showed discrepancies. Dale was recorded in the maintenance bay at midnight on a night when power tools disappeared. Every alleged theft date corresponded to overnight footage showing Dale on site during hours when facilities directors typically weren't working. The pattern was absolutely clear. Dale had been stealing equipment systematically for 6 months, accessing areas during night shifts when only security would witness his presence. Then he'd initiated the inventory audit himself, controlled the investigation, and directed blame toward Raymond by providing carefully edited security footage that showed the guard near theft locations without showing Dale's actual presence taking the items. It was a perfect frame job executed by someone who understood hospital security systems and investigation procedures. Dale had stolen equipment worth tens of thousands of dollars and sacrificed an innocent night security guard to cover his crimes. I compiled the footage onto multiple drives and made copies, understanding this evidence would trigger consequences far beyond Raymond's exoneration. This revealed systematic theft by a department director and potential criminal conspiracy by hospital administration if they'd helped frame Raymond. I contacted Frank Holloway and told him I had security footage showing the actual thief. We met at his office where I presented video from multiple departments showing Dale accessing storage areas during theft dates. Frank watched silently, taking notes on timestamps and locations. When the footage ended, He said this completely changed the case. The evidence clearly showed Dale committing the thefts Raymond had been accused of. Frank asked how I'd obtained footage from so many departments. I explained my methodology without admitting I'd possibly exceeded my authorization. Frank said the footage was compelling regardless of how it had been acquired, and he'd need to interview department heads to verify authenticity and chain of custody. He asked if I'd be willing to testify about what I'd discovered. I said absolutely, but warned that management had been resistant to scrutinizing the evidence against Raymond. Frank said that resistance made more sense now. If Carol Denning had helped Dale frame Raymond, she'd face criminal charges herself. This wasn't just about theft anymore. This was conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of authority. Frank said he needed to move carefully because investigating hospital administration would create significant institutional pushback. He'd need to verify the footage independently, interview witnesses, and build an airtight case before making accusations against someone like Dale Priestley. I left Frank's office feeling vindicated, but anxious about what came next. Dale remained in position at the hospital with full access and authority, while an investigation slowly built momentum. If he discovered people were scrutinizing his activities, he could destroy evidence or manipulate records. Worse, he might identify me as the source of the investigation and retaliate through administrative channels. I decided to keep working normally while Frank conducted his investigation, but staying alert for any signs Dale or Carol had noticed the scrutiny. The following Monday, I was called to Carol Denning's office. She was sitting behind her desk with Dale when I entered. Carol said she'd heard I'd been asking questions about the theft investigation and requesting security footage from multiple departments. She wanted to know why I was conducting unauthorized investigation into matters that didn't concern radiology. I said I'd witnessed events that contradicted the accusations against Raymond and felt obligated to report them. Dale leaned forward and asked what events specifically. I said I'd been working late the night of the alleged final theft and never saw Raymond access storage areas or carry equipment. Dale smiled and said my observations from one location didn't account for Raymond's activities across the entire hospital. Carol said my involvement was inappropriate and disruptive. She instructed me to stop requesting footage and discussing the case with other staff. I said I'd already provided information to law enforcement, and they were conducting their own review. Carol's expression shifted from annoyed to alarmed. She asked what information I'd provided to police. I said security footage contradicting the hospital's evidence against Raymond. Dale's smile disappeared. He said I'd accessed footage without proper authorization and potentially compromised evidence in a criminal investigation. Carol said my actions constituted serious violations of hospital policy and data security protocols. I was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending an internal review. I said they couldn't retaliate against me for reporting evidence in a criminal case. Carol said this wasn't retaliation. This was enforcing policy against unauthorized access to security systems. I was to surrender my badge and leave the premises immediately. Security would escort me out. Dale stood up and offered to walk me to the exit personally, that familiar smile returning. I realized they were trying to intimidate me into backing down, using the same institutional authority they'd weaponized against Raymond. I said I'd already copied the footage and provided it to police, so removing me from the building wouldn't stop the investigation. Dale's smile faltered. Carol told me to leave before she called security. I walked out of that office knowing I'd made myself a target, but also knowing the evidence was now in multiple hands beyond their control. Frank had the footage, I had backup copies, and the investigation was proceeding regardless of hospital administration's resistance. That evening, Frank called to tell me he'd interviewed department heads about the security footage I'd provided. All confirmed the videos were authentic and corresponded to their local recording systems. Frank had also obtained warrant approval to seize Dale's financial records and search his property for stolen hospital equipment. The district attorney's office was treating this as a serious case of theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Frank said my administrative leave from the hospital was likely retaliation, and I should document everything. The investigation would take time, but they had enough evidence to arrest Dale within the week. I asked about Raymond. Frank said they'd already begun proceedings to vacate his charges and were preparing an exoneration statement. Raymond would be cleared completely once Dale's arrest made the frame job obvious. 3 days later, Dale Priestley was arrested at the hospital during business hours. Police executed a search warrant on his office and home, discovering thousands of dollars worth of stolen medical equipment stored in his garage. Financial records showed Dale had been selling the equipment online through anonymous accounts, generating substantial unreported income. The scope of his theft operation was even larger than the initial audit had revealed. He'd been stealing systematically for at least 2 years, not 6 months. The early thefts had been small enough to avoid detection. When the losses became noticeable, he'd initiated the audit himself to control the investigation and direct blame away from facilities management. Carol Denning was questioned extensively about her role in Raymond's arrest. She maintained she'd acted on information provided by Dale and hadn't known the evidence was falsified. Prosecutors didn't believe her. The speed with which she'd terminated Raymond, her resistance to scrutiny of the evidence, and her attempt to suppress my investigation suggested active participation in the frame job rather than innocent cooperation. Carol was charged with conspiracy and obstruction. The hospital board placed her on immediate leave and appointed an interim administrator. Raymond's charges were formally dismissed with a public statement acknowledging he'd been wrongly accused and imprisoned. The district attorney's office apologized for pursuing charges based on falsified evidence. Raymond's attorney filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the hospital, Carol Denning, and Dale Priestley for false arrest, defamation, and conspiracy. The case was settled within 6 months for a substantial amount that included compensation for lost wages, emotional distress, and damage to Raymond's reputation. I was reinstated at the hospital with back pay and a written apology from the interim administrator. My administrative leave was acknowledged as retaliatory and expunged from my record. Several colleagues approached me privately to say they'd suspected something was wrong with Raymond's arrest, but hadn't spoken up. The familiar refrain of people who'd remained silent while an innocent man suffered. The criminal trial for Dale Priestley took place the following spring. Prosecutors presented the security footage showing Dale accessing storage areas during theft dates, financial records proving he'd sold the stolen equipment, and testimony from multiple hospital staff about his control over security systems and audit procedures. Dale's defense attorney argued the evidence was circumstantial and didn't prove Dale had stolen anything. The footage showed him in hospital areas he had legitimate access to as facilities director. His presence during overnight hours could be explained by emergency maintenance or other work responsibilities. The financial records showed online sales, but didn't definitively prove the items were hospital property. It was a desperate argument contradicted by the sheer volume of evidence. I testified about discovering the pattern in security footage and how Dale had attempted to suppress my investigation. Other employees testified about Dale's unusual overnight presence and his aggressive response when questioned about equipment access. Hospital inventory specialists confirmed the missing items matched those found in Dale's possession. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before convicting Dale on all counts of theft, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the hospital and Raymond. Carol Denning's trial followed immediately after. Her defense was that she'd been deceived by Dale and had no knowledge his evidence against Raymond was fabricated. Prosecutors presented email records showing Carol had been notified about inconsistencies in the security footage, but had dismissed concerns and ordered staff to stop questioning the investigation. They showed her attempt to place me on administrative leave for reporting contradictory evidence. They demonstrated a pattern of Carol prioritizing institutional image over truth. Suppressing investigation that might reveal her hiring of Dale had brought a criminal into hospital leadership. The evidence suggested Carol had suspected Dale's involvement, but chose to sacrifice Raymond rather than admit she'd failed to properly vet the facilities director. Whether she'd known definitively that Dale was guilty or simply didn't want to know was legally irrelevant. Her actions constituted obstruction and conspiracy regardless of her precise knowledge. Carol was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 4 years. The hospital board terminated her employment and initiated a comprehensive review of hiring practices and security procedures. Meridian General became a case study in institutional failure and the danger of administrators prioritizing reputation over accountability. The scandal generated state legislation requiring hospitals to implement independent review procedures for employee theft investigations and prohibiting administrators from controlling evidence in cases where they might have conflicts of interest. Raymond never returned to security work. The 3 weeks he'd spent in jail before making bail had traumatized him beyond his ability to function in institutional environments. He'd lost his apartment during the arrest because he couldn't pay rent, lost his car when it was impounded, lost his professional reputation when news coverage identified him as the accused thief. Even after complete exoneration, the stain of accusation remained in background checks and online searches. Employers saw arrest records before they saw dismissal notices. Raymond moved to a different state using his settlement money and found work in private construction. We stayed in contact occasionally through email. He told me once that the worst part hadn't been the jail time or the criminal charges. It had been watching hospital colleagues he'd worked with for 9 years immediately believe he was a thief. How quickly people who'd known him, who'd worked beside him, accepted his guilt based solely on administrative accusations. How little his years of reliable service and character had mattered when weighed against institutional authority. I understood that completely. The same colleagues who'd ignored Raymond's arrest suddenly praised my investigation after Dale's conviction. They claimed they'd always suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to interfere with official procedures. The revisionist history was predictable, but depressing. Nobody had suspected anything. They'd simply accepted the narrative provided by authority and moved on. Questioning that narrative required risk and effort most people wouldn't undertake. I'd stumbled into this investigation through proximity and coincidence, not virtue. I left Meridian General 18 months after Dale's conviction. The experience had shown me that hospitals were less interested in truth than institutional protection, and I couldn't trust administrators who'd so easily sacrificed an employee to avoid scandal. I found work at a smaller medical facility with better oversight and more transparent management. Dale served 7 years before being released on parole. His medical career was permanently ended and he worked manual labor jobs while paying restitution. Carol finished her sentence and moved to a different state where she worked administrative roles outside healthcare. Her professional credentials were permanently damaged. The facilities director position at Meridian remained cursed. 3 people held the job in the 5 years after Dale's arrest, each leaving quickly under various pressures. The department couldn't shake the association with institutional corruption. Raymond's civil settlement included a provision requiring Meridian to establish an employee defense fund, providing legal assistance for staff members facing wrongful accusations. The fund was named after Raymond and administered by an independent board. It helped 3 other employees over the following years, proving the problem of institutional scapegoating extended beyond a single case. I testified at the state legislature about the need for protection mechanisms for employees who reported contradictory evidence in internal investigations. The resulting law provided whistleblower protections and required independent review of evidence in cases involving employee criminal charges. Small victories extracted from systematic failure. What haunted me most wasn't Dale's theft or Carol's conspiracy. It was how easily the system had accepted Raymond's guilt and how resistant it had been to contradiction. Every piece of evidence proving Raymond's innocence had been dismissed, suppressed, or ignored until external pressure forced acknowledgement. The security footage, the timeline inconsistencies, the implausibility of the accusations, all meaningless against institutional momentum. If I hadn't happened to be working late that Friday, hadn't noticed the discrepancy, hadn't had access to departmental security systems, Raymond would be in prison serving a sentence for crimes he didn't commit. That randomness terrified me. Justice had depended entirely on coincidence and individual persistence rather than systematic protections or institutional integrity. How many other Raymond Kutchers were sitting in cells because nobody happened to be in the right place to notice contradictory evidence? How many employees had been sacrificed to protect institutional image or administrative careers? The system wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to process accusations efficiently and move on. Dale Priestley spent 7 years in prison, and Raymond Kutcher spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of everyone's willingness to believe the worst about someone who'd spent his career doing invisible work that kept their institutions functioning. And somewhere in a small medical facility, I processed radiology scans and remembered that justice depends entirely on whether someone happens to care enough to look closer. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.